Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Kelly McSweeney, contributing editor at CNEN Media, and I will be moderating today's event. This webinar is titled, What Does ESG Mean for the Chemical Industry? And is being sponsored by USB. CNEN works with sponsors to identify topics of interest and value to CNEN's audience, and consistent with CNEN's mission to provide news and analysis of the chemistry enterprise in a timely, accurate, and balanced fashion. During the webinar, you can adjust the size of the slides on your screen by grabbing the lower right corner with your mouse. If you need technical assistance, please look at the Help widget at the bottom of the screen or type your query into the Q&A box. If you're disconnected during the webcast, please log in again according to the instructions you received earlier. You are encouraged to contribute to the success of this webinar by asking questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A box on your screen. The questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, and as your moderator, I will be posing as many as time permits. Please note that CNEN does not endorse any company, products, or services that may be mentioned in the webinars, and that each webinar will be archived at CNN Online after the live webcast. The presentation today is being sponsored by USB. The United Soybean Board oversees investments of the Soybean Checkoff, a collective investment by soybean farmers who spend a portion of their product revenue to fund research, market development, and expansion efforts. The 73 farmer directors of USB administer checkoff activities, specifically in the areas of soybean meal, oil, and sustainability. During the presentation, we will hear from Susan Mayer and Steve Block. Susan is a chemical industry ESG senior analyst at Sustainalytics with a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Edinburgh and previous roles in the consumer goods industry and petrochemical data consulting. At Sustainalytics, she covers the global chemical industry, rating and assessing ESG risks that they face and how they manage their risk. Steve Block is senior consultant Omnitech. Block has been involved in the specialty chemicals industry for over 40 years and the bio-based chemistry industry since 2013. Steve joined Omnitech in 2021 and supports the growth of bio-based products in the adhesives, coatings, surfactants, and personal care markets. And I will now hand it over to Susan Mayer.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly. Hello, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon from me. I'm in Amsterdam at the moment. I work for Sustainalytics Morningstar, which is a leading provider of ESG research, ratings, data, as well as sort of a variety of products such as second-party opinions for sustainable bonds, and lots of things like that. I am here specifically to talk to you about ESG in the chemicals industry. And with that, I'm going to give a bit of a overview in ESG in the chemicals industry, why it's important. I'll take you through our methodology for our risk rating in terms of what we take into account, the kind of things behind the scenes that give out the ratings, and then put that into a bit of perspective and do a case study which covers Royal DSM. So firstly, I guess, why am I here today? To tell you about ESG and why is ESG important. So you can see on this slide a sort of variety of screenshots from headlines, both exhibiting sort of positive and negative examples of media. And I think it's just to kind of show that the integration of ESG is becoming an integral part of investment management, and asset owners and managers are developing ways to incorporate this into decision making, and that can be through a sort of variety of ways, whether that's through specifically seeking out companies to put in your portfolio because they perform well on a specific ESG factor or just across the board, or whether that's exclusionary in terms of you're choosing to not invest in this company because they've done something controversial, you're not happy with their practices. And I think also driving this is the kind of greater societal and consumer awareness that we're seeing in terms of the awareness of the planet and society now, and how this is sort of making it more, driving ESG into more mainstream integration. And not only that, I think ESG is driving kind of innovation and partnerships within the chemical industry, which is great to see. We're seeing chemicals companies partnering with recycling companies who are partnering with, say, the consumer goods companies that use the recycling. And it's this sort of joined up thinking that is leading to this acceleration of ESG and the sort of need to incorporate this into your business. And I think this is a trend that's only going to accelerate and become more important, especially as part of your business strategy. So I'll give a bit of an overview on the ratings, so in terms of what goes into them and how it's sort of built up, and then I'll go into a case study. So this is how our rating is made up. It's not overly complex. We have 3 sort of key building blocks in the ESG risk rating: corporate governance, material ESG issues, and idiosyncratic ESG issues. And we consider corporate governance as the sort of foundational element of our rating. And this is just to kind of signify how the effectiveness of a company's corporate governance is crucial to how they're going to execute their business strategy. And this is across all sub-industries we cover. This is corporate governance is kind of the same exposure is set for every company we have. And then we have the kind of bulk of the rating is to do with material ESG issues. And material ESG issues are issues that are deemed likely to have a significant effect on the enterprise value of the company. So we have a list of sort of 20 MEIs. Sorry, MEIs meaning material ESG issues, if I use that. And they are set at the sub-industry level. So, you know what I mean, a bank is going to have different MEIs to a chemical company. And things like carbon emissions, occupational health and safety, these are examples of MEIs. We then have the idiosyncratic ESG issues, which are another part of the sort of third portion, which are these more unpredictable events. So they're not specific to a sub-industry in the example where an accounting scandal is certainly nothing more predictable in one industry than the other, but it could have a significant effect on the enterprise value of the company if it comes out. And when these issues reach a specific threshold, so are considered quite severe, they then are inputted into the company as a material ESG issue, but only for that company, not the whole sub-industry. So in terms of what does the ESG risk rating measure? So it measures the amount of unmanaged risk. So we look at companies' exposure, and that is, we look at exposure and how the company is exposed in terms of their MEIs and how they're exposed to the material ESG issues, and then how they're managing these. So they have this amount of risk, but how are they managing this through sort of policies, programs, management systems, and sort of quantifiably how are they performing? And also in that is, are they involved in any controversies? Have they had any of these sort of issues? And then the outcome of that is the unmanaged risk. I'll go on to the next slide, which will put this in a bit of a more picture view. And you can just see on the right, these are examples of sort of the MEIs which are relevant to the chemical industry. So things like occupational health and safety, carbon emissions, emissions, and waste. And these, just to give you an example of some of these MEIs. And to kind of guess here is, if you've got high exposure to an MEI, but you've got really, really good management, then that's going to be a sort of a low risk situation, where if you've got high exposure to something and you're not managing it well, it's then quite a high risk. And that's sort of how we look at it. So, like I said, to just put that into a bit more easier to see, we have this sort of exposure which is set at the sub-industry level. And then we have this amount of risk. So some is manageable risk. So that is the type of risk that with current technology, with where we are now, how much can actually be managed. But of course, there's a portion of unmanageable risk. So the example given here is that an oil and gas company is likely to face some level of carbon risk until it completely changes its business model. We go back to the sort of the manageable risk. Of that, we then have how much is the company actually managing? So have they got, what sort of policies do they have in place, that sort of thing. If they don't have a policy, then maybe that could be where this kind of management gap comes in. And then overall, the unmanaged risk, so the addition of the managed risk that could potentially be managed given the technology right now, and the unmanageable risk, we then get this overall ESG risk rating, which is just measuring the unmanaged risk. So, and this, yeah, in terms of the exposure, so like I said, it's set at the sub-industry level, and the MEIs are chosen at the sub-industry level. But this is kind of unique to Sustainalytics, whereby we are able to adjust the exposure to kind of take into account different business models. Because you can have, I guess, especially a chemicals company, one that could be involved in substances, contain a lot of substances of very high concern, but also then maybe a company that uses none. And to kind of adjust for these sort of things, also to adjust for things like where the company's assets are based. Are they in risky regions? Are they not? And these sort of things. And that's why we would use betas to adjust this. So in a sub-industry, the beta will be set at 1, which just means they're experiencing average exposure to that issue. But it can go from sort of a range of 0 to 2. So 2 would be, well, it can go above 2, but it rarely does. 2 would be when a company is deemed to be exposed to this issue twice as much as the sub-industry. But on the other hand, we also have if the company is deemed to have less risk in comparison to the sub-industry, we can also reduce it. So a beta of 0.5 would have half the exposure to the sub-industry. So this is how so the kind of first few slides have been about the exposure part, and this is going into the management dimension. So the management score is made up of both these kind of parts, which are the management indicators and the event indicators. So management indicators are what you can see here, like what kind of policies do they have in place? So do they have a environmental policy in place? Do they have things like programs and management systems? So have they got an environmental management system in place? Is it aligned to international standards, that sort of thing? And also, like, do they have, for instance, a greenhouse gas emission reduction program in place? We then also have the disclosure and compliance, and these sort of typically assess a company's use of generally recognised practices such as the Global Reporting Initiative and such kind of recognised practices like that. And then finally, the kind of performance. So you can have incredible management system, you might have really strong systems in place, but how is your performance actually against them? So you might have set a greenhouse gas reduction target, but you might be continually not meeting it. So this is to kind of track that, like, is there an improvement on some of these? So for instance, carbon intensity, water use, that sort of thing. And then on the other side is this kind of event side of thing. So events are essentially controversial things that happen. They are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the most severe, 1 is the least severe, and that's in terms of sort of impact and risk to the company. So that can be sort of environmental impact, in terms of impact to society, anything like that. And then risk could be sort of financial risk to the company, legal and compliance risk, regulatory risk, reputational risk, all this sort of thing. So if it's deemed very high, it then it can impact the company's score. So you can sort of see here, all these management indicators make up what I'd said on the first side. So they've got a really strong, it's rated, the score is out of 100. So you can see they've got a really strong effluent management system, emergency response program, all these sort of things. But they've had an incident here whereby there was a large chemical spill that kind of decimated parts of the environment and human health. And this then immediately makes 50% of this score 0. So that, just giving an example of when these kind of incidents happen, the dilution it can have on the score when it is severe. I'll move on. So I'm going to talk about Royal DSM. DSM is a sort of multinational company active in the fields of health, nutrition and materials, although they I think just sold their materials business. Their company has accelerated the transition into sort of health and nutrition segment, and in 2021 generated over sort of 3/4 their revenue from their health and nutrition segment. And we're just going to basically put what I've just shown you a bit more into perspective. I think it's easier when you see it in a case study format rather than just theory. So I'll touch on, this is just the sub-industries that we cover. So commodity chemicals, diversified, specialty, agriculture and industrial gases. And yeah, we cover sort of hundreds of companies that fit into these sub-industries. And with that, like I said, the sub-industry exposure is, the exposure is set of the sub-industry. There we go. And this is just kind of an example to show you what I meant. So these exposure scores are made up. So you can, are not made up. They're made up like this. And you can see, for instance, I'll just pick out, so the environmental social impacts of products and services is one which is evaluating exactly that, how the environmental and social impacts of the company's products. And you can see here that agricultural chemicals and specialty chemicals are slightly higher exposed to this. The same, if we look at community relations, is only considered a sort of MEI for the agricultural chemicals industry, and this is to do with the sort of large-scale mining that can be involved in sort of fertilizer production and that sort of thing. So this is just to give you an idea, the sort of risks here, where industrial gases are considered to be the least exposed and agricultural chemicals the most. So touching on the specialty chemicals sub-industry first, and then we'll go into specifically DSM. So overall, the specialty chemicals sub-industry has a sort of medium exposure of 54, which is in comparison to the research universe, so that is covering all sub-industries, of 38. And the sort of two I've pulled out here is the kind of most exposed for the specialty chemicals is the environmental and social impacts of products and services. And this is sort of to do with the specialty chemicals are more specific to companies, and their risks could be less well known. For instance, commodity chemicals that have been sort of around for decades and produced en masse, the risks are well documented, and the regulations are already quite strong and well known in comparison to the sort of more innovative products that you can get in specialty chemicals. When they've maybe not been around as long, they might include some sort of complex mixtures and that sort of thing, which can be hard to regulate. And then regulation can be quite a risk in some instances. And this is this sort of can put manufacturers are faced with sort of uncertainty regarding these regulation, and they could be found liable, and these sort of things that then sort of hit their financials. We then also have the emissions, effluents and waste, MEI highlighted here. which focuses on how the company is managing their emissions, not greenhouse gas emissions. So this would be sort of sulfurous oxides, volatile organic compounds, that sort of thing, and any other releases. So also their hazardous waste management and water management, that sort of thing. And again, especially the chemicals companies have high exposure to this because they can be deemed to have more risks of having toxic products that they could be having to manage the byproducts through this. And I will move on to the specific exposure for DSM. So, like I'd said, we've got the sub-industry exposure scores here, which I've just talked through in the previous slides. And you can see sort of overall DSM's experiencing lower exposure. So instead of the 54, they're actually at 49. And this is sort of due to the company's just business model and their lower risk products. So DSM are kind of specialising in human and animal consumption, such as sort of enzymes, vitamins, things like that. And these are deemed sort of lower risk, and this is just to reflect that lower risk. So specifically for the environmental and social impact of the company's products, this sort of beta is adjusting this to sort of say that their exposure is 20% less than the average of the sub-industry. And this is mainly because over a quarter of their revenue, more than a quarter of their revenue, is derived from enzymes, vitamins, things like this, and this is reflected here. The same can be said for emissions, effluents and waste, whereby the company is not having to deal with hazardous products or substances of concern or anything like that. So their exposure is reduced to this. And that is just because they are subject to sort of less stringent regulation around disposal of wastewater and things like that. And the lower risk to the environment if things were released because they're not hazardous chemicals. And to just go into that a bit more to give you more of an insight into the beta factors that I was discussing before, is to just kind of show you how the beta is sort of made up. And this is specifically for the environmental social impacts of products, which I said they're deemed to have 20% less risk to this than the sub-industry. And you can see we look at things like the strong financial metrics of a company, so their operating performance in terms of their net income margin and return on assets, and also things like where the majority of their assets are based, also where are their sales, and this is sort of adjusted based on country risk measures that we look into. And then this quantitative overlay, which is what I was discussing, has been put in there because the company is involved in mainly their sales are coming from lower risk products, and that sort of adjustment is made there with -0.2 to then get to this 0.8 overall and give them this reduced exposure. In terms of DSM's management, you can see here, so basically 100 is the best you can get, but anything above 50 is deemed really strong management. So DSM are performing very well here. They're showing strong management across all of their MEIs. I think the only one that is into average is resource use. And this is particularly around the low toxicity of their products. They've got a vast, so environmental and social impacts products and services also counts things like whether they offer sustainable products, if they've got things like that they've factored into their portfolio. And the company DSM has, so they have a vast sort of sustainable product offering, and they have a portion of their revenue coming from their Brighter Living solutions, which are assessed for having in some way contributing positively environmentally or in an environmental or social way along the chain. So this can include sort of bio-based polyamide and recycled feedstock products that they are feeding into their materials. And also another one where they perform well, which is a particularly relevant one in the chemicals industry, is carbon own operations. So this is just measuring the amount of carbon emissions the company is emitting and how they are managing this. And DSM has set a sort of science-based reduction target to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2030. And it's also put in place a strong renewable energy programme to meet this. So they've joined the climate group's RE100, which is committing to essentially reach 100% renewable electricity. And at the moment, the company is committed to sourcing 75% from renewable sources, and they're already above sort of 60%. So doing sort of very well in this space. So this is the sort of final slide, I guess, to just give you a bit of an idea of where DSM sit in comparison to the sub-industry, the chemicals industry, and our sort of global universe that Sustainalytics covers. And you can see sort of this graph here. The dark blue is showing you the specialty chemicals sub-industry, which you can see is skewed sort of to the higher risk end of the scale. The same as sort of the chemicals industry is also slightly into that skewed to the high end of the scale. But DSM are sat in the low risk category, which is for being a specialty chemicals company, they're performing very well. DSM is sort of a top performer. They've been a top performer for quite a few years, or quite stable since 2018, and their score is sort of in the kind of top percentiles. And like I said, this is driven by their strong management of their emissions, effluents, and waste, and their environmental social impacts of products and services. And just to sort of note that given the kind of the DSM merger, both these companies we've rated, and they both perform really well. So together, both companies, we sort of expect to be driving their sustainable product offering and still likely to do well in terms of the rating, especially how they sort of together include quite a lot of bio-based products. So I will move on. There's my information there. I think the slides will be shared afterwards, and I will pass you on to Steve, who will give you more information on sort of what ESG means in the chemical industry and bio-based chemicals.
Okay. Thanks, Susan, for the introduction and really interesting background. I think I'm going to pick up the part of the conversation here while it says, what does ESG mean for the chemical industry? I think more clearly that from my perspective, as a practitioner or practical matters for those that are in the chemical industry, what does ESG mean for them, and how does that impact what they do? So picking up from some of the higher level things that Susan mentioned, there are also certainly a number of factors across the ESG categories that practitioners look at. And I would kind of think about those who are selecting and evaluating and looking at chemicals might lean a little bit more to the left of the slide, where you look at some of the environmental factors and social factors, particularly around new chemical technology. I'll be spending a little bit of time talking about some examples at the end in biochemistry, bio-based chemicals, or maybe what some people might call non-fossil carbon chemicals, and some of the impacts that has for those who are practicing and making decisions, and how to move from where we are today to a more sustainable nature of the chemical industry. So let me take a little high-level view of what this means, again, from my practical view for those who are thinking that might be you in the chemical industry. There are obviously a lot of investment going on today in commercializing bio-based chemicals. When you do that, there are things that, in my mind, come to the forefront of what is important that must be done to be successful. And I've kind of categorized these as the 4 pillars of success. which are performance, scale, affordability, and environmental impact. Obviously, there's more and more work going on today with bio-based chemicals, new technologies, and they've, if you look back the last, 5 or 10 years, I've been in the bio-based chemical industry about 10 years now. Many companies didn't quite get to where they wanted to go. There are some successes for sure. But I think today, when you look at the ESG initiatives and the priorities and the investments, my anticipation, my expectation is that in the coming years, there'll be more successes because of the support and the investment from the stakeholders. So again, from the perspective of what does it take to be successful, I always think my experience is very practical, from developing products to assessing markets to looking at who cares about what in the industry. That things almost always start with performance. There may be other reasons why people start looking at new technologies, but I always talk about performance from a specialty chemical perspective. And I think about bio-based chemicals as alternatives rather than replacements. And generally, when you're talking about new chemicals, there's a reason that people look at those. And if you have a new molecule, it's never a drop-in, so you look at it as an alternative versus a replacement. There are some one-to-one replacements going on for sure. Ethylene oxide, for example, is one who has a bio-based equivalent to the petrochemical equivalent. Okay, so performance, I think it's pretty clear to people who have been looking at new chemical technologies that if you don't have something unique performance, then you're probably going to struggle to be successful. So from the technical perspective, it's like, hey, what does it do for me, or what does it do for my customer? What's the problem to solve? Do I understand the problem? And I always ask the question of anybody, what is the problem, before you start jumping to solutions? Say, make sure we all understand what the problem is. What are we comparing ourselves against? What are the benchmarks out there today? Understanding the incumbents, and then it's really an assessment of the pros and cons of each option, if you will. And then, of course, you can build the value proposition, which includes not just the technical nature of your chemicals, but also the sustainable components. And scale. Scale is where a lot of things tend to fall apart, and they fall apart with respect to new technologies that look really interesting at small scale. They have some really, outstanding properties. They bring new things to the market. However, when you go from, a lab scale to a pilot scale to commercial scale, can you do that in a way that is technically, equivalent to what you've done in the lab, say, but also economics? If you can get to that, if you can bridge that, lab to plant scale, you really can have a major impact on the economics. Economics are going to really be the bridge to get from the beginning part of some new technology to making it fully commercially successful. And so more about that. We can talk about economics. We can talk about technology, scale, supply chain. But one of the things that we all know is going to come down to, is it affordable? And I say affordable from the perspective of those who are making the products, those who are in the supply, in the value chain, and the end customer. Is that something that's affordable? Recognizing, I think that it's pretty common to say that as new technologies are developed, they have a higher price tag. For example, the EV cars today, or cell phones 20 years ago, or even computers 30, 40 years ago. These things were premium priced. Not everybody could, the adoption rate was slow because of that. But as you see today, look at whatever device you're looking at today, whether it's a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a PC. 20, 30 years ago, those things were pretty much unaffordable to people. But as scale grew and technology grew, then it becomes affordable to everybody. And I think in the chemical industry, that will also happen. One of the things along the way that I've had situations to be involved with is to make sure you're managing the expectations of your stakeholders, to make sure there's no surprises, there's no avoid what I call future shock, because you want to build a business, you have new technologies, but you also want to keep in context the bigger picture. So as you're getting investments, because in the world of ESG today, Susan was talking about, there's a lot of investments, a lot of interest going on right now. And I think that those ESG metrics aligned with the technical and the supply chain and the economic cases that you build for new biochemical technology will just always mean a stronger business case. And the environmental component is is multifaceted. So you talk about things that we in the chemical industry, whether it's around carbon footprint or the toxic nature of your products, or even things like VOCs and the circular nature of our industry. Those are some of the more common things that come up. Health hazards, we always want to manage those, minimize those, mitigate those, eliminate those. That's always the impetus. But there's always another piece of the puzzle is environmental justice, because it's pretty well known that environmental degradation touches areas where there have been underinvestment and the quality of life challenges have suffered more on the human health impacts. And so all that builds what I call build the case, build the story as to why the industry is moving in a relatively rapid direction, as rapidly as it can, towards these more sustainable products really built around non-fossil carbon. I'm going to finish here with a few practical examples. Those of you who might be thinking about what can I do, what can I bring to my company or to the things I'm working on, or to new thinking. One example, building blocks from soybean oil. Some of these are newer to the market, some aren't, but it's been work that's been done over the last number of years to say, okay, there are building blocks out there today. If I'm trying to synthesize a new product, or if I'm trying to have a new ingredient for a formulation, soybean oils are one that are abundantly available, very affordable, and available pretty much globally. Second example, more before a second example, a little bit more on the U.S. soy. So soybeans and soybean oil aren't all the same. They aren't created the same. And why? From a sustainability perspective. The bean itself, the plant, the protein, the meal, the oils that come out of the bean, I would say arguably are essentially the same wherever you grow those. But when it comes to crop management and land use, this was a study that was funded by the USB some years, I think recently, and it builds into the equation the bigger picture of sustainability. It's not just the bean or the plant itself, but the farming practices, as well as the productivity of the land. So you look at where those are geographically, and you see quite a bit of difference. A second example of some success that's happened in the bio-based chemical industry has been, over the last 10 to 15 years, the advent and the commercialization of olefin metathesis of vegetable oils, where in this case we're using a Grubbs catalyst, ruthenium catalyst, to make these unsaturated methyl esters, and then you can continue on to make some additional, bio-based, vegetable oil chemicals from them. And these are on the market. These have been developed. These are what I consider a success story of how you take a commodity oil. It could be a soybean oil, it could be a canola oil, it could be a palm oil, it could be whatever type of oil, which are generally commodity products, and really valorize them to the extent that they become very useful in many, many industries as either ingredients or building blocks. I think the third and last example I want to bring up is a newer set of technologies, lipids, basically as surfactants. And these are really interesting because they are fully bio-based, and it's a combination of a sugar and a fatty acid. You can use different sugars and fatty acids to make the molecule, but these surfactants are now becoming more useful, but as well also more available. I think that's the big thing on some of this technology, whether it's the soybean technology or the metathesis technology or the sphere-lipid technology. It's now that we're moving to the scale where it's not just a technical interest, but there's a real business case to be had around those. I just want to summarize some things here. While there are certainly challenges and some successes and some companies and technologies that have been less successful, there are more and more things that are showing up in our daily life that are success from the perspective of developing bio-based chemicals that are used in products that we probably all know. Some of these, you probably recognize some of the detergents from Procter & Gamble or a degreaser from DeWalt. These all have, plant-based, chemicals in there. Even a new line of paints from Sherwin-Williams. And Sherwin-Williams, as others, they don't replace the product. So you won't see the orange bottle of Tide disappearing from your shelf at Target. You're going to see another category of products put on the shelf aligned with those. So it leaves the consumer to make the choice. And I think what's going to happen, and I've seen this in the last, probably 5 years or so, consumers are choosing. They're choosing those products that are better for the environment, better for the world, and that's leading to higher volume of these products, which alternatively positively impacts the economics. So thanks for giving me a few minutes to talk about from a practitioner's perspective of bio-based chemicals and the ESG and some of the things to think about as you or your colleagues are moving to the direction of bio-based chemicals. So I think I'll turn this back over to Kelly now to see if there's some questions that have come up through the discussions.
Great. Thank you, Steve Block and Susan Mayer, for that excellent presentation. And we do have some questions from the attendees. The first question, I believe, is for Susan. How do you determine the weighting for your overall computation?
So I guess it's something I probably can't share, but it's our weighting is something that is it's kind of dynamic. So it's something that we look into on a sort of annual basis and kind of adjust things to how we see how the risks are developing. But yeah, it's something I can't really probably talk about the weightings, but it's something that is part of our rating is the fact that it is dynamic and these can change. So as technology changes or we see that people are making different sort of putting more changes in place, we can then adjust the overall MEI weighting and that sort of thing.
And the next question is, can you comment on how subjective versus objective the MEI exposure ratings are? And does it vary by MEI?
I feel like you've almost answered the question there. Yeah, I think it does vary by MEI. I think everything can be slightly subjective, but in our instance, we have a sort of quite a extensive review process, so the subjectivity is able to be taken out of it slightly. But I think it's very different when you think of a carbon emission indicator, which is very easy to measure. You're either improving or you're not improving, versus a sort of human capital development, which is obviously harder to kind of assess from an outside looking in sort of thing, especially when, like the human capital metrics, a lot of companies will probably disclose this less than they will the carbon ones. So then it's a case of kind of trying to look into their initiatives, what sort of programs do they have in place? Like, are they going above and beyond with their sort of human capital development? Are they putting sort of leadership programs and that sort of thing in place? And we kind of delve a bit more into the type of initiatives they have in that sense, rather than when carbon emissions, you're more looking at some of the data points, but also you are looking at the programs they have in place, but you're able to sort of assess how the programs are working more through that. So yeah, I'd say there is a level of subjectivity and it does vary by MEI. So yeah, you're correct.
Next question is for Steve. How can I, as a chemist, make a case for using bio-based materials in my lab?
Yeah, that's actually where it starts. I'm in the lab. What do I want to do? And I think the first thing is there a problem to solve? I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier. How do I approach a challenge and looking at the alternatives? One of the things that helps me or helps people I work with is to look at the health hazards and environmental aspects of chemicals. Because if you can kind of distill those down to those that are better or not, that helps you make choices. And it's all around choices. There are, catalogs today of things that are identified as safer to use. I would point people to the US EPA Safer Choice Program, the Safer Chemicals Ingredient List, which is a fantastic repository of chemicals, and there's a lot of data around there. The second catalog I would look at is the USDA BioPreferred. Both of those have many thousands. I just got an update recently from EPA. I don't remember. It's well over 1,000 individual chemicals. So that's where I would point you to start looking at technologies that meet those environmental, health, and safety requirements.
Next question is regarding the exposure score. Is consideration taken for the chemicals used in the manufacture of the product chemicals? That is, even if a product is low risk, there could be some high risk solvents used in the manufacture or processing.
Yeah. I probably focus too much on just the products, but yeah, we look into what is used in the manufacturing process because, yeah, exactly that. Some of the solvents that are used can be sort of more toxic, even though they're the chemicals that's coming out or the products they're producing are sort of harmless. So yeah, it's something we look at. We look at the kind of substance of concern they import and use in their products. And also, basically we do take it into consideration.
Yeah. Let me jump in on that one too on solvents because it's a pretty important topic. Even though some people might say, well, it's not really involved in the chemistry per se, but solvents are a large source of environmental health and safety concerns in the world. And looking at there are very good bio-based solvents that are commercial today. They have different properties than the traditional petrochemical solvents, but I think to some degree, or even a growing large degree, the bio-based solvents are clearly those who are moving in the direction of replacing the solvents for some of the reasons that Susan was talking about. That it also helps the ESG scores, but it really helps the worker exposure, environmental impacts, and it, to some degree, even helps product performance.
Susan, what does the team look like? Is there a human capital team that assesses multiple companies, or is there a DSM team that sits together? The attendees are interested in how you make the process as objective as possible.
So we have sort of different teams, so not necessarily a human capital team. So in the chemical industry, I'll sort of cover the majority of the chemical industry indicators, but we then have teams that are split. So we'll have teams that will look at the sort of some of the quantitative figures and things like that. We have a specific corporate governance team that is completely separate, and they look at the sort of all the things to do with the board structure and sort of all the corporate governance indicators. But we have, so we'll do the sort of indicator research, I guess, and then we'll have, it goes through a sort of review process to make sure that, you're not favourably scoring or anything like that. And also we have sort of in a separate side, I guess, thematic experts who you would then go to and they'll maybe have more of a view on things, whether that is, we have things like biodiversity or water or things like that, people that are more specialised in the human capital aspect who you can then sort of will then help out and that sort of thing. So it's not so much that each indicator is done individually, but they're done over different teams sort of interact, I guess.
All right, the next question is, could you comment on why the carbon footprint for soy in Argentina and Brazil is so large?
Yeah, I think to some degree it has to do with the farming practices as far as what chemicals are used in the farming practices, as well as the productivity. You know, how many bushels of soybeans do you get per acre, for example? That plays a large role of it, because you're going to talk about using equipment, you know, farm equipment, that's going to have a carbon footprint. And if you get more bushels of soybeans per acre, then that goes down accordingly. So I think those are the key aspects. Like I said, I think the technical nature of the bean is the bean. It doesn't change much. It's how you actually farm and harvest those.
Steve, do you anticipate a significant slowdown in adoption of new bio-based technologies at the consumer choice point, given rising inflation? Or have we historically seen these environmentally focused choices made by consumers regardless of external economic factors?
Okay, let me get my crystal ball out here for a minute. But my gut feel says I don't think so. Maybe that's a little because from the perspective of there's so much interest in the world today in environmental issues. There are always the economic challenges. However, if you do look at some of the bio-based alternatives or natural alternatives to, say, you know, home cleaning products, and I did a little informal survey at some of the big box stores around the country in the last year or so, there are marginal price premiums, if any. I did, for example, I looked at some Clorox products, and they had the traditional version and their natural/bio version, and they were exactly the same price on the shelf in the store. So I maybe to some degree a little bit, but I really don't think that's going to slow down much at all. Matter of fact, it's going to need for bio-based or non-fossil carbon, because one of the things that biochemistry brings is the elimination of the impact of the volatile nature of the price and supply of petrochemicals. So I think longer term, it's certainly the right thing to do.
Do you worry about long-term versus short-term risk?
Well, always. You have to think about risk and what does risk mean. So if you the risk to do nothing is greater than the risk of doing something. And I think that's the key message, is doing nothing doesn't get to us where we want to go in our climate goals, in our environmental goals, and our environmental justice goals.
Susan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I think that was summarized very nicely in the way that Steve's just said that. Completely, I would agree. So, yeah, I think it's hard sort of from an ESG risk point of view, whereby where do you, like, trying to consider both. So what's going to, and I think the things such as when controversies happen, you're considering like what's happening there and then, but what is the kind of long-term implications of these, I think, are things that are becoming more, have to be considered when we think of companies that have had products that are now only being, say years ago, that are now only being sort of being made liable for them now. So it really is, yeah, from short to long term, it's important to consider both.
Next question is for Susan. Is there a limit on the material ESG issues that are attached to a specific sub-industry?
So yes, there's a limit of around 10, I think, is the overall limit. And this is just to kind of have the most, the ones that are most significant financially to be sort of at the forefront. There's no point having lots that are not really going to make much of a difference to the company. So it's important to have a sort of view which is, sort of zoned in specifically for a sub-industry. And yeah, there is time, so in, like, you see all the material ESG issues that were across the chemical industry, but some different sub-industries have sort of got ones deactivated that are not relevant. And that's the same in certain certain companies in sub-industries could have one deactivated if it's completely irrelevant to them. So yeah, there is a limit, and yeah, but we kind of stick to it just to make sure we focus on the specifically the financially material ones.
Steve, what do I need to know before replacing petrochemicals with bio-based chemicals in my lab or manufacturing environment?
The first thing that always comes to mind is don't think of these as replacements, because the molecules are different. They're alternatives. So you have to keep in mind that you have to understand the entire chemical profile of a new molecule, whether it's the solubility, the HSP, the HLB, molecular weight, polarity. Really need to understand that and build up new kind of uses for those, whether it's a formulation of, say, a personal care product, or even a solvent that's being used as in an industrial process. They have different behaviors, so be wary of trying to say, I'm going to take out one of these and put in one of these new molecules. That generally doesn't work. So just keep that. That's the very first thing I think about.
Susan, is ESG standardized?
So I guess no, it's not standardized in terms of our methodology is different to our competitors, for instance, but I'd say we are following the kind of same principles pretty closely, just in our own sort of way, I guess. So they will be tracking the same things as us, from how exposed a company is, how much they're managing this risk in terms of policies, programs, things like that. But we might, when we have this sort of beta principle where we can adjust the companies, other companies might, competitor ESG risk rating companies may have something slightly different. So it does make it harder. I think initially when ESG rating was around, the standardization was, I think, very poor when you consider it to the sort of credit agencies, for instance, which are always quite aligned, even though they may have slightly different methodologies. But I think now you're starting to see much greater alignment across the kind of chain of competitors, whereby if a company's rated highly, it's usually pretty highly rated across the board with different competitors. So it's not standardized per se, but I also think I think it's driving to being more standardized.
All right, that's all the time that we have. Thank you again, Susan Mayer and Steve Block, for your fascinating presentation. And thank you, participants, for being a great audience. Be sure to check CNEN or CNEN Online for information on the next edition of CNEN webinars. Thank you On24 for technology and production services. And thank you, USB, for the sponsorship that made this interactive webcast possible. For CNEN webinars, I'm Kelly McSweeney. Goodbye.